The city rose like a proud drumbeat against morning sky. Glass towers caught the sun and threw it back in sharp flashes, while below them narrow streets stretched in tired silence. In those streets, dust clung to broken sidewalks, and forgotten people moved like shadows between wealth and hunger. In this city, riches spoke loudly from above, but suffering whispered from below. Everyone lived under the same sky, yet not everyone was seen. At the center of the city's power sat an old woman whose name carried weight heavier than gold. She had started life with empty hands and bare feet, selling small goods by the roadside when she was young. Hunger had been her teacher, and hardship her closest friend. Through years of struggle, sharp thinking, and unbending will, she built an empire. Now people called her a queen, though she wore no crown. Elders respected her. Leaders feared her. The poor spoke her name with hope and distance at the same time. To her, life followed clear rules. A child must obey. A family name must be protected. Discipline was love, and silence was strength. She believed that when you give a child opportunity and guidance, the rest is their responsibility. In her eyes, failure was a choice. Within the high walls of her compound, stories were told about her wisdom. Yet stories were also told in whispers, about her hardness, about how her heart had learned to close itself to survive. Still, no one doubted her power. Once, within that same compound, laughter had lived. A young girl ran through the halls with bare feet and bright eyes. She was a granddaughter, raised in comfort but taught respect. She greeted elders properly, listened more than she spoke, and dreamed quietly of a future shaped by kindness, not fear. The old woman saw promise in her and believed she was preparing a worthy heir to the family's name. Then one day, the girl was gone. At first, it was explained simply. She had been sent away, entrusted to relatives to learn independence and humility. But days turned into months, and months into uneasy silence. Questions were asked softly, then not at all. The family began to speak in firm voices, instead of curious ones. They said the girl had changed. They said she had refused guidance. They said she had chosen her own path and wasted the chances given to her. The grandmother listened. She did not ask many questions. Pride sat beside her like an old companion. In her heart, she believed the child had turned her back on discipline. A child who rejects guidance invites hunger, she often said, repeating words taught by elders long before her wealth arrived. Outside the compound, the city continued its dance of excess and need. In one of its forgotten corners, behind a row of shops and rusted fences, a dumpster stood as a wall between shame and survival. There, among discarded things, the girl lived. Her clothes were worn. Her hands were rough, but her back was still straight. Even as hunger pressed her body, dignity guarded her spirit. She spoke little, trusted less, and learned to sleep with one eye open. Fate, which African elders say walks on its own feet, led the grandmother that way one afternoon. A wrong turn, a delayed convoy, a moment unplanned. Her car slowed near the market's edge, with a smell of waste mixed with the sound of tired sellers packing up their goods. That was when she saw her. The girl lifted her head slowly, as if pulled by an unseen thread. Their eyes met. Time stood still. The city noise faded into a dull echo. Wealth and poverty faced each other without walls. The grandmother stepped out of the car, disbelief hardening her face. Her voice came sharp, not with cruelty, but with shock wrapped in authority. "Where's the car I bought you?" The words hung in the air like a struck drum that refused to stop echoing. The girl said nothing. Shame burned her cheeks, but she did not bow her head. In that silence lived hunger, betrayal, and a truth that had waited too long to be heard. People nearby slowed their steps. Some recognized the old woman. Others only saw a rich elder standing before a homeless girl. Whispers began to grow, feeding on confusion. How could the child of such wealth sit among trash? How could blood be broken so completely? The grandmother felt something unfamiliar press against her chest. Doubt, the kind that cracks even the hardest stone. For the first time, she wondered if silence had hidden more than disobedience, if pride had closed doors that should have remained open. As the sun dipped lower, its light touched both their faces equally. In that shared glow lay a question larger than wealth, heavier than shame. How does a child raised in gold fall into dust? And who truly failed her? The city woke each morning like a drum struck from two sides. On one side, tall glass buildings stood proud, shining under the sun like polished shields. On the other, narrow streets stretched in silence, carrying the tired footsteps of people who lived day to day. In this city, wealth and hunger shared the same air, yet never spoke to each other. It was a place where progress moved fast, but many were left behind, unseen and unheard. Above the noise of the city lived a woman whose name carried power. People spoke it carefully, the way one speaks the name of a strong storm. She had not been born into comfort. Her childhood knew dust, not marble floors. As a young girl, she woke before sunrise, helping her mother sell small goods by the roadside. Hunger taught her discipline. Hardship taught her patience. Failure taught her never to bend. Years passed, and she learned the ways of trade, land, and people. She learned that kindness without strength could be crushed, and strength without rules could destroy. Slowly, step by step, she built an empire. What began with small profits grew into businesses, properties, and influence that stretched across the city and beyond. Elders respected her because she remembered tradition. Leaders feared her because she never forgot a debt. The poor admired her from afar, hoping her shadow might one day bring relief. Inside her heart lived one unbreakable belief: discipline builds legacy. To her, love was guidance, and guidance was firm. She believed children must learn early that the world shows no mercy to those who ignore wisdom. A tree that grows without straight roots, she often said, will fall in the first storm. Within her guarded compound, silence and order ruled. Yet once, laughter had filled those walls. A young girl lived there, her granddaughter. She had been raised with comfort, but not carelessness. She was taught to greet elders with respect, to listen more than she spoke, and to carry herself with dignity. Her eyes were bright with hope, and her heart still believed the world could be gentle. The grandmother watched her closely. In the girl, she saw the future of her name. She believed she was shaping her well, preparing her to carry both wealth and responsibility. But as time passed, the grandmother grew distant, trusting others to guide the child further. The girl was sent away to learn independence, to be shaped by relatives who promised care and discipline. Then, slowly, the drumbeat changed. News returned not with clarity, but with whispers. The girl had become difficult, they said. She had refused guidance. She had disrespected rules. Each message reached the grandmother like smoke, thin but persistent. She did not ask to see the fire. Pride told her elders must not be questioned. Silence wrapped itself around truth. She has chosen her own path, the grandmother said firmly, and the world will teach her what I could not. Within the family, judgment replaced concern. Some spoke with false sadness. Others had quiet satisfaction. No one defended the girl loudly enough. In a house full of voices, her side was never heard. Far from the compound, the city showed its other face to the girl. Doors closed before she could explain. Employers turned away when her name brought no support. Friends disappeared like water into dry ground. Hunger became her daily companion. Yet even as her body weakened, her spirit stood firm. She refused to beg with her soul, even when her hands shook. Behind a market, beside a large dumpster filled with discarded things, she found shelter. The place stank of waste and rejection, but it hid her from the world that had already turned away. There, she learned to survive quietly. The dumpster became a cruel symbol of how easily society throws away what it no longer understands. One afternoon, fate walked its crooked path. The grandmother's car slowed near the market after a wrong turn. Her eyes moved across the street, then stopped. Something pulled at her chest, sharp and sudden. A thin figure sat near the dumpster, lifting her head slowly. Their eyes met. The grandmother stepped out, disbelief freezing her steps. Her voice came strong, shaped by years of command. "Where's the car I bought you?" The words cut through the air. The girl said nothing. Shame burned her face, but she did not look away. In that silence lived pain, betrayal, and questions too heavy to speak. People nearby watched, whispering. Wealth stood before poverty. Blood stood before silence. For the first time in many years, doubt entered the grandmother's heart. She felt it crack something hard within her. As the sun lowered, lighting both faces the same way, one question rose louder than the city itself. How did a child raised in abundance fall into disgrace? And who truly turned away first? The city breathed like a living thing. By day, its tall glass buildings shone proudly, reflecting the sun like mirrors of success. By night, their lights glittered above dark streets, where people slept with worries as their pillows. Wealth and poverty lived close, yet they did not greet each other. One looked down from balconies of steel and glass, while the other survived in alleys filled with dust and forgotten dreams. In this city, one name traveled faster than traffic and louder than drums. When people spoke it, they lowered their voices, not because the woman was cruel, but because her power was heavy. She was an elder shaped by struggle, a grandmother who rose from dust to command respect. Long ago, she had stood where the poor now stood, selling goods under the hot sun, counting coins with tired fingers. Hunger sharpened her mind, loss hardened her heart. Survival taught her that the world rewards only those who stand firm. Step by step, she built herself into a pillar no storm could easily shake. Businesses grew under her watch. Land answered to her signature. Leaders listened when she spoke. Elders nodded when she passed. To the people, she was a symbol of what discipline could achieve. They admired her strength, yet feared her judgment. In African tradition, such elders are seen as living laws, respected, unquestioned, and obeyed. Do not cross her, people whispered. She remembers kindness, but she never forgets disobedience. Inside her guarded compound, order ruled like a silent guard. Every stone had its place. Every voice knew its limit. To her, tradition was not old, it was eternal. She believed a family's name must be protected like sacred ground. Children were not raised with softness alone, but with firm hands and clear rules. A child guided too gently, she believed, will be broken by the world. Yet within that strict order, love once lived quietly. Her granddaughter grew under her roof, wrapped in comfort but taught restraint. The girl rose early, greeted elders properly, and listened with respect. She was clever, observant, and hopeful. When she smiled, it softened even the hardest rooms. The grandmother watched her from a distance, proud but reserved. She believed showing too much warmth weakened authority. In her heart, she told herself she was preparing the girl for a world that showed no mercy. As the girl grew older, the grandmother stepped back. Other family members offered to guide the child further, promising to teach her independence and humility. Trusting blood and tradition, the grandmother agreed. In African homes, elders believed family should protect family. Questioning that belief felt like questioning wisdom itself. Then the silence began. Messages returned slowly, wrapped in concern but filled with judgment. The girl was changing, they said. She no longer listened. She questioned rules. She wanted too much freedom. Each report fed the grandmother's fears. Pride closed her ears before truth could enter. She remembered the old saying and repeated it firmly. A child who rejects guidance invites hunger. The family nodded. No one challenged her words. In homes like theirs, elders are not questioned. Silence was seen as respect, even when it hid lies. Soon, the girl's name was spoken with disappointment instead of hope. The family assumed she had wasted her chances, embarrassed her legacy, and chosen her own fall. Far away from that powerful name, the girl faced a world that no longer recognized her. Doors closed when she knocked. Jobs vanished when support was missing. Friends disappeared when her value seemed gone. Hunger followed her closely, but it did not break her spirit. Even when she slept near a dumpster behind a busy market, she carried herself with quiet dignity. The trash beside her became a cruel symbol of how society throws away what it no longer understands. Fate, which elders say never walks straight, led the grandmother there one afternoon. A delayed journey, a wrong turn. Her car slowed near the market's edge. The smell of waste mixed with roasted food and dust. Then her eyes caught a familiar shape. The girl lifted her head slowly. Time froze. The grandmother stepped out, shock tightening her chest. Her voice came strong, shaped by years of command and belief. "Where's the car I bought you?" The words fell like stones. The girl said nothing. Shame burned her face, but she did not look away. Around them, people stared and whispered. Admiration met fear. Wealth stood before poverty. Blood stood before silence. For the first time, doubt crept into the grandmother's heart. As the sun lowered, lighting them both the same way, a question rose heavier than pride and louder than whispers. How did a child raised in respect and abundance fall into disgrace? And in a world where elders are never questioned, who had truly failed to listen? In the early days, before silence became louder than truth, the girl's life flowed gently like a calm river after rain. She lived within high walls, but her heart was not trapped by them. Each morning, she rose before the sun fully stretched its arms across the city. She washed her face carefully, tied her hair neatly, and greeted the elders of the house with respect, lowering her eyes the way tradition taught her. Those who saw her often said, "This child carries light without noise." She was raised in comfort, but comfort never ruled her. Fine clothes covered her body, yet humility guided her steps. She was taught that wealth was a tool, not a crown. When food was served, she waited until elders were satisfied. When visitors arrived, she listened quietly, learning the weight of words and the power of silence. The grandmother watched from a distance, never praising too openly, believing that strength grows best in quiet soil. The girl loved learning. Books became her closest friends, and questions lived freely in her mind. She dreamed of using her education to help others, especially those whose lives looked nothing like hers. Sometimes she would sit by the compound wall, listening to the sounds beyond it, the calls of street vendors, the laughter of children playing with nothing but dust and hope. In those moments, her heart felt heavy and curious. One afternoon, she once asked softly, "Grandmother, why do some people have so little when others have so much?" The old woman did not look up from her work. "The world is not fair," she replied calmly. "That is why discipline matters. Without it, even those with much will fall." The girl nodded, accepting the words, though her heart still searched for gentler answers. She was intelligent, not only in school, but in spirit. She noticed when servants were tired and thanked them. She listened when elders spoke of old times, of villages, of droughts and survival. She believed tradition held wisdom, but she also believed kindness gave it meaning. Many saw her as soft, but softness did not mean weakness. It meant she felt deeply. As she grew older, expectations followed her like shadows. Family members watched her closely, measuring her steps, her words, her future. Some smiled warmly, others with hidden envy. The grandmother, proud but distant, believed she was shaping a successor worthy of the family name. Yet she also believed distance built strength. Too much closeness, she thought, created dependence. When the decision came to send the girl away to live under the guidance of relatives, it was spoken as wisdom. "She must learn to stand without leaning on my shadow," the grandmother said firmly. Elders nodded in agreement. In African homes, such decisions are rarely questioned. The girl accepted the news with respect, though fear quietly settled in her chest. "I will do my best," she said softly, bowing her head. "I will not bring shame to our name." The grandmother nodded once. "Remember who you are," she replied. "The world is not gentle." The girl carried those words with her as she left the compound, believing guidance would follow her wherever blood lived. But she did not know that envy can win the face of family, and silence can become a weapon sharper than any blade. At first, she tried to please everyone. She worked hard, obeyed rules, and held on to her dreams. But slowly, the warmth she expected turned cold. Whispers followed her steps. Accusations rose without proof. Her humility was mistaken for weakness. Her silence was used against her. Each lie placed between her, and the truth reached the grandmother without challenge. Back at the compound, reports arrived wrapped in disappointment. The girl was changing, they said. She questioned authority. She wanted too much. The grandmother listened, her face hardening with each word. Pride sealed her lips. She believed elders must not be doubted, and discipline must not bend. Far from comfort, the girl's world began to collapse piece by piece. Support vanished. Protection was withdrawn. Doors that once opened easily now stayed shut. Yet even as her life fell apart, her dreams did not fully die. They slept, wounded but alive. By the time fate led the grandmother to that forgotten corner of the city, the girl had learned a painful truth. Wealth can disappear. Family can fail, but dignity must be guarded like fire in the wind. As they stood facing each other, one wrapped in power and the other in dust, the past hovered between them, a past filled with care, opportunity, and dreams left unspoken. And the question remained heavy and unresolved. How did a child raised with so much love and promise fall so far, without anyone hearing her cry? The answer waited in silence, ready to break free. The city rose like a mirror of two souls. On one side, glass towers caught the sun and threw it back with pride, shining over wide roads and guarded gates. On the other, narrow streets bent under the weight of forgotten lives, where cracked walls whispered stories no one wanted to hear. In this city, wealth and hunger shared the same sky, yet never the same table. People said the city had a heartbeat. In the morning, it beat fast with ambition. At night, it slowed, heavy with regret. At the center of its power sat the grandmother, a woman whose name was spoken softly and with care. She had built her empire from dust and stubborn faith. When she was young, she sold fruit by the roadside with bare feet and bold eyes. When she was older, she owned banks, factories, and land that stretched farther than some people's dreams. Her back was straight, her voice firm, and her eyes carried the weight of many victories. Elders respected her. Politicians feared her. The poor admired her from afar. She believed in order. She believed a child must bend before the wind of wisdom or break under the storm of life. Discipline is love with a strong hand, she often said. To her, tradition was not a chain but a staff that helped one walk straight. Legacy was sacred. Blood was duty. Her home reflected her beliefs. Wide halls, quiet walls, and portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch and judge in silence. Once, laughter had lived there too. The granddaughter had grown up under polished roofs and soft lights. She had been taught to greet elders with lowered eyes and steady respect. She read books that opened her mind and listened carefully when wisdom was shared. She dreamed not of ruling, but of serving, of doing something good that would make her name gentle on people's tongues. She had been hopeful. She had been kind. Then one day, she vanished in the family's golden world, like morning mist under harsh sun. At first, the family spoke in low tones. Some said she had become proud. Others said she had refused guidance and chased foolish freedom. The grandmother listened but did not ask many questions. Silence, to her, was also an answer. A child who walked away without permission was a child who chose hunger, or so she believed. She wasted her chances, relatives murmured behind closed doors. She shamed the family, others added. The grandmother's face remained hard. Inside her chest, love knocked, but pride did not open the door. Time moved on, as it always does, stepping over pain without apology. Fate, however, has its own path. One evening, the grandmother's convoy slowed near a market road she rarely used. Construction blocked the main street, forcing her through a forgotten part of the city. Her driver frowned at the narrow road, but she said nothing. Her eyes wandered beyond the window. That was when she saw her. Behind a rusted dumpster, where waste and flies gathered, a thin young woman sat on a torn mat. Her clothes were faded. Her hair was wrapped neatly despite the dust. Her back was straight, even in weakness. There was dignity in her stillness, like a drum that refused to crack even when beaten too hard. The grandmother's heart stumbled. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes cutting through shadow and dirt. The car stopped without command. The door opened. People nearby froze. Whispers spread like fire through dry grass. The grandmother stepped out, her shoes touching ground that had never felt such weight. She stared at the girl. The girl looked up slowly, as if lifting her head required more courage than lifting a stone. Their eyes met. Blood recognized blood before the mind could deny it. The grandmother's voice broke the air, firm and sharp, carrying disbelief and authority in equal measure. Where's the car I bought you? The words fell heavy, like a verdict passed too soon. The girl's lips trembled. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. Shame wrapped around her like cold cloth. She lowered her gaze, not because she was guilty, but because pain had taught her humility. People gathered at a distance, watching. Some gasped, some shook their heads. Some smiled, pleased to see power confused. The grandmother's hands clenched at her side. Confusion battled anger in her chest. This was not how wealth behaved. This was not how her blood should sit, behind a dumpster like something thrown away. Questions rushed her mind, but none escaped her mouth. How did comfort become cold concrete? How did guidance become silence? How did a child of gold fall into dust? The city seemed to hold its breath. The girl swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. Grandmother. That single word carried years of absence, hunger, and unanswered prayers. The grandmother looked at her, truly looked this time, and for the first time, doubt crept into her certainty. Pride stood tall, but something beneath it began to crack. In that moment, surrounded by waste and watching eyes, the question rose like a spirit that refused to be buried. Was this truly rebellion, or was it a wound left unattended? The city resumed its heartbeat, unaware that blood and silence had just collided, and nothing would ever stand the same again. The city stood like a drum beaten from two sides. One side rang with pride and power, tall glass buildings rising toward the sky, reflecting the sun as if they owned it. The other side echoed with quiet suffering, narrow streets, broken pavements, and people who learned to walk fast so their pain would not be noticed. In this place, wealth and poverty lived as neighbors, yet never spoke to each other. Elders said the city never slept because it carried too many secrets. Among its most powerful figures was the grandmother. Her name alone could open doors or close mouths. She was not born into comfort. Her hands once knew hunger, and her feet once chased opportunity through dust and heat. Step by step, she built her empire with patience and iron will. Every coin she earned carried sweat. Every success came with sacrifice. People respected her strength and feared her judgment. When she spoke, others listened. When she decided, there was no debate. She believed deeply in tradition, in rules passed down like sacred fire. To her, a child was clay. If shaped early and firmly, it would stand strong forever. An undisciplined child, she often said, is a curse that grows teeth. Her home was large and quiet, filled with reminders of legacy, old photographs, carved symbols, and the steady silence of power. Yet behind those walls, something important had been missing for a long time. The granddaughter had once filled that space. She grew up surrounded by comfort, but she never walked with arrogance. She greeted elders properly, listened more than she spoke, and carried hope in her eyes. She believed education was a bridge, not a throne. She dreamed of making her grandmother proud, not by wealth, but by purpose. For a time, life seemed balanced. Then the silence came. One day, the girl was no longer seen at family gatherings. Her phone stopped ringing. Her name became uncomfortable on people's tongues. Relatives whispered that she had changed. Some said she refused guidance. Others claimed she chased freedom without responsibility. No one asked her side. The grandmother listened to these stories but asked no questions. To her, silence meant guilt. A child who disappeared without permission had chosen her own path, and its consequences. She wasted her chances, one aunt said. She forgot where she came from. Another added. The grandmother's face stayed firm, but her heart tightened like a rope pulled too far. Pride wrapped around her concern, and tradition locked the door to compassion. In her mind, public shame was heavier than private pain. Time passed. Seasons changed. The city kept growing, swallowing stories as it always did, until fate decided to speak. One afternoon, the grandmother's car was forced to take a different route. Roadblocks and traffic pushed her into streets she never visited. The air felt different there, thicker, slower, heavy with survival. She looked out the window, distracted, until her eyes caught a familiar shape among the unfamiliar mess. Behind a large dumpster, surrounded by waste and flies, sat a young woman. She was thin, her clothes worn and faded. Yet her back was straight. Her head was covered neatly. Even in hardship, dignity clung to her like a stubborn shadow. The grandmother's breath caught. "Stop the car," she said sharply. The driver hesitated, then obeyed. As the car door opened, the noise of the street fell quiet. People nearby paused, sensing something unusual. Power had stepped onto forgotten ground. The grandmother walked closer, her sharp eyes studying the girl. Then recognition struck like thunder. Blood does not lie. Her voice came out before her thoughts could catch it, strong and filled with disbelief. "Where's the car I bought you?" The words cut through the air. Some people gasped. Others leaned in, hungry for drama. The girl looked up slowly. Her eyes widened, then softened. Shame washed over her face, not because she had sinned, but because suffering had taught her humility. "Grandmother," she whispered. That single word carried hunger, rejection, and years of unanswered prayers. The grandmother felt the ground shift beneath her certainty. This was not rebellion standing before her. This was survival. This was her blood sitting where society threw away what it no longer wanted. Whispers grew louder. "How can the queen of wealth raise a beggar? Is that really her granddaughter?" The grandmother stood frozen, trapped between anger and confusion, pride and fear. Questions rose like dust in her chest. How did wealth fail to protect blood? How did silence become punishment? How did a child of gold fall into disgrace? The girl lowered her eyes again, holding on to the last piece of dignity she owned. The city resumed its noise, but something sacred had cracked open. Blood and silence stood face to face, and the truth, long buried under pride, began to stir, waiting for its time to rise. The city breathed like an old storyteller, telling two stories at once. On one side, tall glass buildings rose proudly, their windows shining like mirrors to the sun. Inside them were soft carpets, quiet offices, and people who spoke in numbers and contracts. On the other side, just a few streets away, the road cracked under tired feet. Rusted shops leaned on each other for support, and children learned early how to read faces instead of books. Wealth and poverty lived face to face, yet they never shared a meal. The elders said the city was powerful but restless, because it was built on forgotten voices. At the heart of its wealth stood the grandmother. Her name traveled faster than her footsteps. She was known as a woman who bent fate with her hands. She was not born into comfort. She carved her rise from hardship as a young woman. She woke before the sun and slept after it. Hunger taught her discipline, and struggle taught her control. By the time success arrived, she had already hardened her heart against weakness. People admired her strength. They feared her silence more than her anger. When she entered a room, conversation slowed. When she spoke, decisions ended. She believed deeply in tradition. To her, life was a straight road. Elders guide, children follow, and respect keeps the path clear. She often reminded her family, a child who rejects guidance invites hunger. In her world, discipline was love, and obedience was protection. Legacy mattered more than feelings, because feelings could change, but a family name must stand firm. Her home reflected her beliefs. It was grand but strict, filled with symbols of heritage and success. Every object had a story, and every story carried a lesson. Yet for all its wealth, the house carried a quiet emptiness, like a drum with a torn skin. That emptiness was shaped like her granddaughter. The girl had once moved through those halls with light steps and warm greetings. She was raised in comfort, but never drowned in it. She listened when elders spoke, greeted visitors with respect, and asked questions not out of defiance but curiosity. Her mind was sharp, her heart hopeful. She believed the world could be improved, not just owned. She dreamed of learning, of standing strong in both tradition and change. She wanted to honor her grandmother, not by copying her, but by growing beyond fear. Then one day, she disappeared. At first, it was small things. She missed family gatherings. Her phone stopped ringing back. Her name became a pause in conversations. Relatives filled the silence with assumptions. Some shook their heads and said she had grown proud. Others whispered that freedom had spoiled her. She refused guidance. One uncle said she thought she knew better, and then added, the grandmother listened. She did not ask for proof. To her, silence was confession. A child who walked away without explanation had chosen rebellion, and rebellion, in her mind, always ended the same way. Still, at night, she sometimes stared at old photographs and felt a tightness she refused to name. Time moved forward, as it always does. The city grew louder. The gap between glass towers and broken streets widened. Then fate crossed the grandmother's path. One afternoon, traffic forced her car off its usual route. The smooth roads disappeared, replaced by narrow streets filled with noise and struggle. The driver slowed, uneasy. The grandmother looked out the window, her sharp eyes scanning a world she rarely acknowledged. That was when she saw her. Behind a large dumpster, surrounded by waste and shadows, sat a young woman. Her clothes were worn, her body thin, but her posture was straight. She covered herself neatly, as if still honoring rules no one else cared about. Something pulled at the grandmother's chest. "Stop the car," she commanded. The door opened, and the sounds of the street faded into a heavy silence. People nearby watched, sensing power step into the forgotten space. The grandmother walked closer, her heart pounding against years of control. Then recognition struck her like a drumbeat. Blood spoke before pride could silence it. Her voice came out sharp, filled with disbelief and authority. "Where's the car I bought you?" The words fell hard. The girl looked up slowly. Her eyes widened, then softened with shame and pain. She lowered her gaze, as if the ground could hide her. "Grandmother," she whispered. That single word carried hunger, rejection, and unanswered prayers. The grandmother froze. This was not the rebellion she imagined. This was her blood, sitting where society threw away what it no longer valued. Around them, whispers rose like dust. How can the queen of wealth raise a beggar? What kind of child ends like this? Confusion wrapped around the grandmother's pride. Shame crept into her certainty. Questions she had buried began to breathe. How did wealth fail blood? How did silence become punishment? How did a child of comfort fall into disgrace? The city continued its noise, but something sacred had been disturbed. Blood and silence stood face to face, and the truth, long ignored, waited patiently, ready to demand its voice. The city was alive, but spoke in two voices. On one side, glass towers pierced the sky, reflecting the sun's sharp light and the ambitions of those who live within them. Inside, wealth breathed quietly, soft carpets, polished floors, hushed voices counting fortunes. On the streets below, forgotten alleys told another tale. Rusted shutters, cracked sidewalks, and children who learned to survive before they learned to read whispered a harsher truth. Here, life was measured not in gold or silver, but in grit, and how long one could stand when the world pressed down. Wealth and poverty stood side by side, never touching, yet haunting each other like old spirits. Amid these towers of ambition lived a woman whose name made even the boldest merchants bow in thought before greeting. She was a grandmother, a matriarch who had built an empire from nothing. Every coin she owned had been earned through sweat and patience, through choices that many would have shunned. Her rise had hardened her heart. Her eyes, sharp as the spear of the village hunter, could pierce falsehood without a word. Discipline and tradition were her allies, respect and legacy her armor. She believed in the old ways. Elders guide, children follow, and the family name stands taller than individual desire. Her house was a palace of memory and pride. Every corner told a story, each object placed with care, each painting and sculpture whispering lessons of triumph and caution. Yet, despite the grandeur, the halls echoed with silence, a reminder that wealth could build walls, but it could not fill hearts. Her granddaughter had once filled those halls with light, born into comfort. The girl had grown with the guidance of wealth and the warmth of love. She had walked with poise, listened with humility, and dreamed with hope. Her mind was sharp, her heart gentle. She respected the traditions of her grandmother, but she also questioned, not out of defiance, but to understand. She longed to merge the old ways with the world she saw outside their gates, believing that both honor and compassion could coexist. Then, one day, the light dimmed. She vanished. At first, it was only small signs. Empty chairs at family meals, unanswered calls, letters left unopened. The household whispered theories. Some said she had grown proud, too self-assured for their guidance. Others believed she had wasted the opportunities their wealth afforded her. The grandmother listened quietly, her thoughts heavy. In her eyes, silence was confession. A child who disappeared without explanation had chosen rebellion, and rebellion was never without consequence. Yet, deep within her chest, a quiet ache grew, a suspicion that perhaps the story she'd been told was only half-truth, and that blood might be bleeding in silence. Fate, as it often does, intervened when least expected. One afternoon, the car carrying the grandmother was forced off its usual route by the snarled traffic of the old city. The sleek, familiar streets gave way to narrower lanes, crowded with life and struggle. From her tinted window, her eyes, ever sharp, scanned the alleys. Among the clutter of the forgotten, something stirred her memory, a movement, a posture, a presence. She stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of the street. Spices, smoke, decay, and yet her attention was fixed. There, behind a towering dumpster, sat a young woman. Her clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, yet she carried herself with a dignity that had not been stripped away. Her hands rested calmly on her knees, her gaze steady despite the filth surrounding her. This was not just any child of the streets. This was her granddaughter. The grandmother's heart beat fiercely against her ribs. Shock and disbelief mingled with the authority that had defined her life. She approached, each step measured, her eyes never leaving the girl. The people around them sensed the weight of the encounter, whispering, stepping back, and letting silence stretch between the matriarch and the girl. Then the grandmother spoke, her voice sharp, commanding, carrying both blood and legacy. "Where's the car I bought you?" The girl lifted her eyes. They were tired, yes, but still held that quiet intelligence that had once charmed the halls of their home. She lowered her gaze immediately, a gesture of both shame and recognition. She did not speak, for words had failed her many times before. Silence was her shield now. Around them, the city's hum seemed to pause. The sharp edges of glass towers and the soft despair of the streets converged into a single moment of reckoning. People whispered among themselves, "How can the queen of wealth raise a beggar?" Their words were knives that cut the air, but the grandmother did not flinch. She felt confusion, not her pride, and shame prick at her heart. Her mind raced. How could a child born into abundance fall to such despair? How had blood, wealth, and love failed to protect her? The girl remained seated, her dignity intact though her body bore the mark of neglect. She did not reach for the car, nor for any comfort. She simply sat, waiting, as if time itself had slowed to witness the reunion of what had been lost and misunderstood. The grandmother's silence carried thunder. Her thoughts battled tradition, pride, and a dawning realization. She saw, in that moment, the chasm between what she had believed and what might be true. For years, assumptions had replaced inquiry, and authority had silenced understanding. Here, behind the garbage of the city, lay not rebellion, but perhaps the consequences of silence, the cruelty of unchecked pride, and the harshness of societal whispers. Blood and silence faced each other, and the city, both rich and poor, seemed to hold its breath. The old woman's mind reached for the wisdom of the ancestors. The tallest tree can still rot from within. Gold can buy many things, but not loyalty, dignity, or truth. In that pause, a question as heavy as the sun rose above the street. How had a child of wealth been allowed to fall into disgrace? And who was truly at fault? The moment held both horror and possibility. The granddaughter's eyes flickered up briefly, seeking acknowledgement, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps understanding. The grandmother's gaze softened imperceptibly, though her stance remained firm, as if the weight of her empire and the depth of her traditions were pressed into the street before her. Here, among the forgotten and the powerful, the first step toward truth was taken. Silence spoke louder than accusations, and in that silence, the seeds of revelation waited, ready to bloom, to challenge pride, and to restore the dignity that had been lost. The city continued to hum. But for a brief moment, the heartbeat of family, of blood, and of understanding echoed louder than all else. The city gleamed under the African sun, its towers of glass and steel reaching for the clouds, reflecting ambition and power. Below, the forgotten streets told a different story. Dust clung to the corners. Children ran barefoot over cracked sidewalks, and the air carried the scent of smoke and spiced food. Here, wealth and poverty lived side by side, strangers to one another, yet bound by the same sky. This was a city of contrasts, where the fortune of a few cast shadows over the many. In the midst of this world of light and shadow stood a woman whose presence could silence a room without a word. She was a grandmother, a matriarch whose name carried both reverence and fear. From nothing, she had built an empire. Each coin, each building, each deal bore her mark of discipline and resolve. She believed in the old ways. Children must honor their elders. Family comes before self, and a name once tarnished is nearly impossible to cleanse. Respect and legacy were her commandments, and she ruled her household and empire with an iron heart wrapped in the cloth of tradition. Her house reflected her life. Grand and orderly, filled with objects that told stories of triumph and trials. Every corner spoke of lessons learned, victories earned, and sacrifices made. Yet, amid the beauty and power, silence echoed. The halls whispered that wealth can build walls, but not mend hearts, and tradition, while protective, can blind even the wisest. Her granddaughter had once filled these halls with laughter, curiosity, and hope. Born into comfort, she had been taught respect, intellect, and grace. She listened carefully to the lessons of her grandmother, yet she also questioned the world, seeking understanding, not defiance. She dreamed of bridging the old and the new, of honoring her lineage while embracing a world beyond the palace gates. Her mind was sharp, her heart gentle, and her spirit resilient. Then she disappeared. At first it was subtle. A missed dinner, a room left untouched, letters unanswered. Rumors spread among family and staff. Some whispered that she had become proud, that wealth had poisoned her sense of duty. Others claimed she had squandered her chance to uphold the family name. The grandmother, stern and proud, believed only one thing: a child who vanishes from the guidance of her elders has chosen rebellion, and rebellion, in her world, had a price. Yet, beneath her pride, a small, persistent worry gnawed at her heart. Perhaps the story she had been told was not complete. Perhaps the truth had been buried under assumptions. Fate moved swiftly. On a day thick with sunlight and the hum of the city, the grandmother's car moved along familiar streets. But a detour brought her through the alleys of the forgotten. Here, the glass towers felt distant, and the world smelled of life in its rawest form. Among discarded crates, peeling posters, and the sharp scent of decay, she saw a figure. Her steps faltered, her breath caught. There, behind a rusted dumpster, sat a young woman. Clothes were worn, frayed, and patched, yet the poise she carried refused to be diminished. This was no ordinary child of the street. It was her granddaughter. The grandmother's eyes narrowed. Shock, disbelief, and an unfamiliar tenderness battled within her chest. She moved closer, each step measured, her presence commanding attention from the few who lingered nearby. The city seemed to pause, sensing the gravity of the encounter. "Where's the car I bought you?" she demanded, her voice sharp, layered with authority, disbelief, and the weight of generations. The granddaughter's gaze lifted briefly, meeting her grandmother's with quiet strength. She did not answer. Words had failed her before, and silence had become her shield. Around them, life continued, yet it seemed to bend, to wait, as if the air itself acknowledged the gravity of the reunion. The people of the street whispered, "How can the queen of wealth raise a beggar?" Their curiosity, judgment, and gossip were like daggers in the sun. The grandmother felt a pang of shame, not for herself, but for the world that had allowed this to happen. Confusion wrestled with anger in her mind. How could child, raised in abundance, find herself abandoned here? How had blood, wealth, and love failed to protect her? The granddaughter's hands rested on her knees, calm and resolute. Her dignity remained intact. Even when the body it housed had endured neglect, she did not reach for comfort, nor for the car that symbolized her lost privilege. She waited for recognition, perhaps understanding, perhaps forgiveness, from the woman who had once been the queen of her world. The grandmother's chest tightened. Silence spoke louder than accusations, revealing the deep chasm between belief and truth, pride and understanding. Years of assumptions, of rigid adherence to tradition without inquiry, had allowed a child of her blood to fall. She understood now the first truth of wisdom. Authority without listening can wound those it seeks to guide. The city continued its rhythm. Some hurried, some lingered, some stared, but in that narrow alley, time slowed. Blood met silence. Pride met humility. Wealth met dignity stripped bare. And in the tension of that moment, a question hung over them both. How had the light of privilege turned to shadow, and who would bear the responsibility for the fall? The granddaughter lifted her eyes one last time. A flicker of hope passed through them, fragile yet undeniable. The grandmother softened slightly, though her stance remained firm. Tradition and power, wealth and love, all weighed heavily upon her. And yet, within this meeting of past and present, a door to truth began to open. Silence stretched between them, heavy but sacred, a pause in which the future of their bond trembled. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, the first seed of understanding was planted, one that would grow only if pride could bend, if wisdom could guide, and if the strength of family could confront both shame and love.